before we jump in, I kind of wanted to give just a little bit of context just of where we're going to be at today. So the funny part is this wasn't planned at all, but remember last week when Luke talked about, we were in Lamentations 3, and we were talking about lamenting, and it was Jeremiah's Lamentations. So it wasn't planned at all, but Lamentations 1 through 5 is all of Jeremiah's laments. And today you can go ahead and turn your Bible there today, but today we're going to be there in Daniel 3. So some context behind Daniel 3 is it's in the exile, and we were talking about how they were struggling. Jeremiah was struggling, and he was lamenting, and we had to learn how to lament. Well, Daniel 3, where we're going to be at today, Daniel has 3 friends, and you might know them. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now try saying those 10 times fast. I mean, I could not. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's where we're going to be at today. And one of the things that stuck out to me a lot last week when Luke was preaching, he did a fantastic job. But when he was preaching, something that stuck out to me a lot is that lamenting is good. We have to learn how to lament. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be upset, but we can't curse God. It's okay to be upset. So part of the asking questions part, something that stuck out to me a lot, is how many of us in this room have had a moment where it's like, hey, where's God at in this moment? Or like, God, I just don't feel you in this moment. I don't feel that you're working. Like, I know you are, but I just don't feel it. Have we had that moment? Oftentimes, we're asking these questions because we're going through tough times and we're struggling, and we just feel like God is just so distant from us. But I'm so excited for this passage today because we learned how to lament last week. And as we're looking at the struggles of our life, this passage just shows how God can show up in the midst of all of your struggles. So before we jump into this passage today, I'm going to pray for us. So let's pray. Dear God, I just thank you for this day. I just thank you for this time, God, where we can come and just worship you. God, I pray that the distractions in this room, God, that there would not be any. God, that maybe somebody that you're sitting next to, maybe that person needs to hear this message. So God, I pray that the distractions will not be here in this room tonight. And God, I pray that you would speak through me. May they not be my words, but may they be yours. And God, just open our hearts for your word tonight. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So are you ready for the word? Yeah. All right, so like I said, Daniel 3, we're going to start in verse number 8. All right, so verse 8 says, "Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made it a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, the lyre, the trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Now there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up.'" So we've kind of opened this passage in these first 5 verses, and we see that Nebuchadnezzar has created this golden image. And he describes this golden image in the first kind of 7 verses of chapter 3. So I encourage y'all to go back and read that. But in those first 7 verses, he describes what this golden image is. And it's basically just an idol. And whenever they hear the sounds of these instruments and all this music, they're supposed to just bow down and worship this image. And if they don't worship the image, they're going to be punished for not doing it. If they stand up and they say, "Hey, I'm not going to worship that. You've told me I have to worship this, but I'm not going to worship it." And if you had that and you did that and you made that decision, oftentimes, and actually every single time, they would come at you and say, "Hey, we're going to punish you because you are not following what we have told you to do." When they hear this sounds, they're supposed to bow down. And it leads me to my first point. And my first point is, as believers, we must guard ourselves from the idols of this world. I understand that that's tough because in the world, we have so many different things being thrown our way. I mean, walking as a Christian in 2024 might not be the easiest thing. In fact, it's not the easiest thing. We live in a world where there's so many material things that can become our idols. There's so many, like our cell phone can be a huge idol. It's so easy to prioritize those over God. So we must guard ourselves from those idols. But one thing that's kind of stuck with my mind this past semester, as I've been playing soccer in college this past semester, and it went really well. But one thing that's been stuck in my mind is sometimes when we have an idol in our life, it might not be a material thing, but it might be an activity that you have. Maybe you play a sport in the room. Maybe you're an athlete and you play soccer, football, all of them. I'm not going to name them all because I know I'm going to forget some of them. But maybe you play a sport, or maybe you do band, or maybe you do theater, or maybe school. You just really love school. And if you really love school, that's fantastic for you because I don't. But maybe you have an activity that you just allow to take up so much of your time. And you're just passionate about that thing so much. And hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that being passionate about those things is wrong, that being passionate about sports is wrong, that the sport you play and you want to go, and maybe you want to play pro or you want to play at the next level. Being passionate about that isn't wrong. Being passionate about your job is not wrong. Being passionate about school is not wrong. A band, theater, whatever activity is, being passionate about it is not wrong. But is it more than Jesus? Is that more? Are you more passionate about that than the calling that he has placed on your life? Man, it's so easy to give in to the idols of this world. And I just love the example that we're getting here in verse 12 from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That these men, it's not they're paying a little bit of attention, but they're paying no attention. Not any attention at all. They don't even serve them. They don't worship them. Nothing. They're not distracted. It's so hard to be in this world because, man, there's so many distractions. We go through so many distractions, and it's not easy. And even with these instruments that are being played so loudly, and they're just all these distractions, and they're not focusing on them. But man, they're worshiping the God that they're supposed to serve. So we see that there's that tension. There's tension between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and there's tension between them and the king. And the king is like, I'll throw you into the burning fiery furnace if you don't worship these images. But they're standing up. They're standing firm. So we've seen that there is so much spiritual warfare, and it's everywhere, and it's so evident that it's in here in this first section of this passage. But let's jump back in. And let's look at the response that these three men have to the king. So let's hop back in verse 13. So verse 13 says, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So we see the response of the king. He's not happy because they're going against what he told them to do. But man, it's not saying he's just mad, but he's furious, rage. The Bible tells us he's furious. And he commanded, he said, hey, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, let's bring them here. We're going to talk to them. We're going to see what's going on. And we're just going to see if we can kind of get them to worship this image. So he questions them. He questions them in verse 14. He says, hey, is it true you don't worship them? But then 15, he tells us, hey, if you're ready to worship them, then that's good. So he's heard that they've not worshiped them, and he's like, okay, if you're ready to worship, like, that's good. It's fine. We won't throw you into the furnace yet. And so he questions them. He gives them a chance. He's holding it out there, and he's saying, hey, here it is. You can come. You can worship it. He's holding it right in front of their face. And I love just verse 17 and 18. As 16 starts it, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, hey, we don't have to answer you. But then they answer, and it shows the faithfulness that these three men have. And they declare, they say, hey, we're not going to serve your gods. We're not going to serve the images that you've put in the place. And guess what? Our God will deliver us from that furnace. He will deliver us from the struggling. He will deliver us from the suffering. Like, wow. Like, these men are being so faithful to the Lord because they know that God is in control of their situation. And that leads me to my second point. And that's, as believers, we must stand firm and be faithful to God. We must stand firm and be faithful to God. So we have to guard ourselves from those idols, and then we have to stand firm, and we have to be faithful to the God when the idols are being thrown at us. They're trusting that God will deliver them out of this furnace. They're trusting that God will deliver them out of any situation that they're going to face. They continue to remain faithful to the one and only true God, the most high God, the only living God. And I just want to speak on this. I understand, man, it's so tough to live as a Christian in 2024. It's so tough to live in this world as a Christian and standing firm and remaining faithful to the Lord. It's not easy. It's not easy, man. The world, it's throwing so many things our way. It's questioning you for your faith. It's looking at you and you say, hey, why do you believe in Jesus? Why do you follow him? Why do you believe in him? And you're going to face all this suffering in your lifetime. You're going to go through this time, and it's evident that you're going to go through suffering. And some people look at you and say, why do you still worship Jesus if you're going through suffering? Why are you still going to worship him? You're in pain right now, and you're still going to worship him. I thought he was supposed to take away all the pain. I thought he was supposed to take away all the suffering, but it is evident that in this lifetime, we'll still endure suffering. But here's my question. That in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of your struggles being a high school student in 2024, in the midst of those struggles, are you going to continue to remain faithful to God? Are you going to continue to stand firm to what you believe? Are you going to continue to stand firm to what the Bible tells you? Are you going to continue to stand firm? Are you going to trust that he's in control of your situation? When it feels like your situation is out of control, when it feels like you don't know what's going on and you don't know how to get through it, are you going to trust that he's in control? That he walks with you every single day? Man, I understand it's not easy. I'm in your generation. I just graduated from the Point last year. I mean, it's tough. It's tough to live as a Christian who walks faithfully to the Bible. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're facing this spiritual warfare. They're facing this struggling in this passage. And oftentimes we are faced with this too. Let me tell you about a little bit of an experience that I've had throughout my first year of college. When you get to college, man, I don't care if it's the most Christian school in the country, there's still unbelievers at that campus. You're in high school right now. I don't care if it's Metrolina, there's unbelievers on that campus. There's unbelievers at Piedmont. There's unbelievers at Porter Ridge, at Union Academy, at Independence. There's unbelievers all around. So it's so tough to live through that. And maybe you're facing this right now. Maybe somebody's looking at you and questioning you for your faith. And you don't know how to answer it. Or you don't know why they're questioning you. You're confused because you're like, God, where are you at? Where are you at in this situation? I don't know how to get through this. They're questioning me, and I don't know what to say. For my athletes in the room, like I said, I just finished my first college season, and it was a tough year, and it has its ups and downs. And let me tell you, it's tough to be a Christian and walk faithfully to the Bible in a locker room. It's tough to be a Christian and walk faithfully to the Bible on the field. Because to be honest, you're surrounded by a bunch of people who probably don't. That's the reality of it is. I witnessed 2 locker rooms this past year. For those of you that don't know, I told some of you, but for those of you that don't know, I transferred halfway through my first year of college. I was at one school at first, and then I transferred. I'm at North Greenville University now, like I said at the beginning. And I've seen 2 different locker rooms. In my first semester, it was tough. I'll be real, it was tough. To live as a Christian in that locker room was not easy because I felt so alone, because I'm pretty sure I was one of the only ones that was trying to live as a Christian there. I had 2 buddies that were on the soccer team, and I could talk to them about anything, and they would help me walk through that. So let me tell you, it's not easy to live for Christ on a sports team. I hear you. It's not easy at all. But man, remain faithful. Stand firm to what God has, the calling that he has placed on your life. Stand firm to what the Bible teaches us. And it's hard. It's hard to live as a Christian. And not just athletes, for everybody. It's hard to live as a Christian in public schools. It's hard to live as a Christian in the secular world. But that does not mean it's not possible. That does not mean that it is not possible. So we're seeing the faithfulness from these 3 men. We're seeing what they're going through, kind of the spiritual warfare, the religious persecution that they're facing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been questioned so much already. They've been questioned, and they said, hey, why do you, who's going to deliver you from this? So we see that tension. But man, the best thing is they're trusting in the Lord. They're trusting that he has control over their situation. Even when it feels like it's getting out of control, they're trusting that, hey, God, you have control of my situation. I wonder who needs to say that in this room tonight. Saying, hey, God, you're in control of my situation. Maybe you need to leave a situation at the feet of Jesus because you're like, I don't know what to do. Leave it to him. You might be struggling in that situation. And trust in the Lord that he has control of that. And if you're thinking about the king, Nebuchadnezzar, he's got to be even more mad now, right? Like they're questioning him and say, hey, why are you doing this? And then they give this response and they say, hey, yeah, we're not going to serve your gods. We're not going to worship them. But even if he doesn't deliver us out of this furnace, we're still not going to worship him. So he's got to be furious now. I mean, the pot is boiling. He's probably overheated. So let's see the response to the faithfulness that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have displayed. Let's jump back in verse 19. So verse 19 says, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed. Against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Let's stop for a second. 7 times? It's typically like really, really hot. But he's ordering it 7 times hotter than normal. So that's really hot. The normal one is more than your average campfire. This one's obviously 7 times than your average campfire. So let's jump back in. So verse 20. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into this burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments. And they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was so urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the flame of those fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the mighty men that threw them into the fire, they died. That's how big this fire is. That's how great, that's how much 7 times is. The mightiest men of the army, imagine like huge, like big, buff, 6-foot tall dudes. And this fire killed them. That's how big this fire is. Verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. So throughout this entire passage, I kind of just want to point a couple of things out. Throughout this passage so far, when I was studying for it, I realized that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're never mentioned separately. It's never mentioned and said, yeah, Shadrach was thrown into the fire, and then they waited a couple seconds. And then Meshach was thrown into the fire, and then they waited a couple minutes. And then Abednego was thrown in the fire. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that they fell into the fire at different times. No, it talks about them all at the same time throughout this entire passage. I mean, just look at these past couple of verses we've read. His face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered some of the mighty men to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And those men who took them up, and they put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the fire. Am I making sense here? Do you see that they're not mentioned separately? Even when their names are not mentioned, it's either these men, it's they, or it's their hats, it's their tunics, their garments. They're mentioned the same every single time. They're friends that are faithfully walking together through this fire. They're friends that are struggling through this time, but they're not going through it alone. Which leads me to my third point. And it's that as believers, we must surround ourselves with fellow believers. We must surround ourselves with fellow believers. If we're going to stand firm and be faithful to God, it's hard to do that on your own. So have those good and those godly friends next to you that are going to speak into your life and call you out for things that you may be doing wrong. We see these three men, they're walking faithfully together. They're walking faithfully. They're being persecuted for their faith. They're being questioned for their faith, and they're walking together. And I don't know who needs to hear that tonight. Maybe you have a lot of friends, and some of them are Christians, but some of them are not. And don't get me wrong, it's okay to be friends with non-believers. That's not a bad thing. But the people who speak into your life, your best friend should be a believer. Your boyfriend, your girlfriend should be a believer. I'm sure the adults can attest to this. The person they married has probably been a believer because they walk faithfully together. So man, surround yourselves with those biblical, intentional friendships. Like I said, it's okay to have friends that are non-believers because then we can share the gospel to them. But man, the people that speak into your life, the people that call you out for the things that you're doing wrong, that are against the word, man, those should be believers. And not just believers, but man, they should be people trying to live according to the Bible as well. Surround yourselves with believers. A little story, background story on this. During my first semester, like I said, I struggled a lot. I went through a lot of things. I was surrounded by not a great community. I was surrounded by people who had an addiction to drugs, an addiction to alcohol, an addiction to sex, an addiction to partying. I was surrounded by that community. Surrounded by people who looked at me and they said, hey, try this. Try this substance, try this drink. Hey, I'm going to go get with this girl tomorrow. I'm going to go get with this guy tomorrow. I'm going to go get with this girl tomorrow. I was surrounded by people that my entire first semester, and it was not easy. But I remember when I would go through those situations, and every single time they offered me something, I found the way to say no. I always found a way to say no. And sometimes I'd be sitting in my dorm room like, how? How in the world am I walking through this and I really don't have anybody that's physically here with me right now, and I've been able to say no to all of this alcohol, drugs, all that stuff that people have thrown at me? How was I supposed to say no? And I was recalling back, and I always remember that the foundation that was built here, man, this youth group built a huge foundation, and that's so important. If you can be here on Wednesday nights, man, be here. Because this is a community that is honestly like no other. You will always have this community no matter how far away you go. You could go to California. You could go across the world. This community will always be here for you. And some of my best friends I've met through this community. My best friend, he's sitting in the back, so he knows who he is right now. And I called him one night when I was struggling this semester, my first semester. I called him one night, And I mean, I called him several nights, but I remember this one night. And I called him, and every single time I called him, he picked up the phone. And if he couldn't pick up the phone, he'd text me, he'd be like, hey, give me like a couple of minutes, I'll be there in a second. So every single time I called him, he'd always picked up. And when I called him this time, I said, hey, I don't know what to do, man. I'm stuck in this situation. I'm surrounded by all these things that I really don't want to be surrounded of. I didn't know what I was getting into when I first accepted to go to this college. I didn't know what I was doing. And he sat there on the phone, and I just let it all go to him. And he didn't look at me because it was on the phone. But he said, hey, I understand you're in those situations. This is when I was figuring out, hey, I think I need to transfer. He was like, I know you're in those situations, and I know it's tough, and I know you witnessed those things, but guess what? Man, just try and continue to seek Jesus in every situation, no matter if it's the good or the bad. Continue to seek Jesus in every situation. So when I thought that was one of the worst situations that I could have ever gone through, he said, hey, seek Jesus. And I had a couple of people tell me, hey, seek Jesus. Try and seek Jesus in those situations. When I thought that was the worst situation, I looked at it at a different perspective. I stepped back and I said, you know what? That made me stronger. That made me stronger as a Christian. That made me stronger as a believer, as a person who wants to become a future pastor. It made me stronger. So when you're in those situations, I don't know, for my seniors, I don't know where you're going next year. Some of you, I do know where you're going, but I don't know where you're going next year. It could be a Christian university. It could be a secular university. It does not matter. There will be parties on that campus. So when you're going through those situations, and it doesn't even have to be the partying. When you're going through a tough situation, and even in high school too, when you're going through a tough situation, surround yourselves with fellow believers because there's a community here that is here for you. There's a community here that wants to love you, that wants to help you, and wants to help you grow in your faith. So man, make it intentional to be here on Wednesday nights. Put this as a priority. And surround yourselves with those good, intentional, biblical friendships. I can't stress that enough because it has helped me through so much, and it can help you through so much too. Because the people you hang out with, they influence you a lot. The people you sit at lunch with, they influence you a lot. The people who you hang out with every single day, have sleepovers, all that fun stuff, they influence you a lot. And I know you've heard the saying, because Justin said it before on a Wednesday night, and my mom has told me this 50,000 times, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Show me your friends and I'll show you your future. That means if you're hanging out with people who want to do things of this world, if you're hanging out with people that struggle with things of this world, and they're probably going to throw some of that stuff on you too. They're probably going to look at you and say, hey, try this. Try this new thing I got. It's so important wherever you're going. Surround yourselves with those believers. In school, in work. And even if your best friend doesn't even go to the same school as you, that's okay. But build that foundation here. Because it's so important. Because the people who you surround yourself with, they influence you so much. So as believers, we must surround ourselves with fellow believers. So we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're walking together through this fire. They're getting ready they've been thrown into the fire. So let's pick back up in verse 24 and let's see how the story ends. So verse 24 says, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to the counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered, this is the best moment ever. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they came out from the fire. And the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw that the fire had had not had any power over the bodies of those men. Their hair of the heads was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed. No smell of fire had come upon them. That's crazy, by the way. They were in this huge fire that's bigger than your average campfire. And when you go to an average campfire, you smell like fire for days, probably. It takes forever to get that campfire smell out of those clothes. And they did not even smell like fire. Let's pick it back up. Verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship my God or any God except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses be laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. They were placed in that furnace. It was 7 times hotter, and God brought them out of it. God brought them out of the fire that was so hot, they didn't even smell like it. That's how good God is. That's how much he does for you. When it feels like he's not working, he's there. There's a 4th man in the fire. So my point 4, my last point, is if God was faithful then, he will be faithful now. If God was faithful in the time of Abraham, if God was faithful in the time of Noah, if God was faithful in the time of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he will be faithful in your situation right now. He will be faithful in your struggle right now. Sometimes we walk through life, and the fires that we walk through, guess what? They won't always be extinguished. All the struggles that we go through, they're not always going to be taken away from us. But that does not mean that God is not going to walk with you in that fire. God walks with you in every situation that you walk through. So if we can put John 16:33 up there. It says, "I have said these things to you." This is one of my favorite verses right now. "I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, because I have overcome the world." That's Jesus speaking here. This is Jesus speaking in the Gospel of John. It's evident we're gonna face suffering this lifetime. You're gonna go through struggles. You're gonna suffer. It's not gonna be easy. But when you're struggling in the midst of the pain, when you're struggling, look at the cross. Look at the cross. Because you have a hope. We learned that last week. You have a hope in Jesus, a living hope. Man, I don't know what your home situation is. I don't know. Maybe your parents, we talked about this last time, maybe your parents just sat you down and they said, "Hey, we're splitting up." Or maybe that's been the reality of your life, your entire life, and you don't know a life with your parents together, and you're struggling through that situation. Maybe in your family, there's a sibling that's walking away from Jesus and you don't know what to do, and you're struggling with that so much, and it's brought so much anxiety and so much stress. Can I tell you something today? I don't know if that's your situation, but what I do know is Jesus has overcome that situation. I don't know what happened in school this past year. Maybe you struggled with academics. Maybe you struggled with anxiety, depression. I don't know what happened this past year in school. Maybe you don't know what your next step is. Maybe for my seniors, you know what your next step is, but you're like, I don't know if I'm ready to step into that. And it's brought so much anxiety. It's brought so much stress onto your life. Can I tell you, I don't know if that's your situation, but what I do know is Jesus has overcome that situation. I don't know, maybe you have an addiction that you're struggling with right now. Maybe there's an addiction to sin that you're struggling with and you don't know how to get through it. And you feel like it's gotten a hold on your life and you don't know. I don't know if you're addicted to sex, drugs, alcohol, pornography. I don't know what it is. I don't know what you struggle with, but can I tell you something? Jesus has overcome that. Jesus has overcome that on the cross. He died for you so that we could live. He took the death on the cross, and the reality is that Jesus really did die. But guess what? He was buried, and guess what? He rose again. That he did not stay dead. He rose again 3 days later. So we have a living hope. So when you face that temptation, Every single time you struggle with it, every single time you go through that temptation of sin, every single time the anxiety takes over you, look at the cross, because the Savior bled for you and he bled for me. And maybe you're here tonight and you don't know what that means. And man, I pray tonight would be the night that you would accept Jesus. But the last part that I want to get to y'all tonight, and I have a challenge for you, and I have a story that I'm going to finish it up with. So we've seen that Nebuchadnezzar, he saw them come out of the fire, and he actually turned to their God. He said, hey, let's worship their God. So this past semester, I had two buddies, Ryan and John, and shout out to them. They're awesome dudes. They were on the soccer team, and I was in the locker next to them. So I got the awesome time of being with them all semester, and it was fantastic. So during the first semester when I wasn't there, John was an unbeliever. John had not professed faith in Jesus Christ. He didn't know what was going on. He was struggling so much with his life, but he didn't know about the living hope that we had. And all Ryan was doing, he didn't even say anything to him yet, but all Ryan did is he was living for Christ faithfully in the locker room, faithfully on the field. He was living for Christ and showing what it's like to be a Christian, showing what it's like to live for God. And during the second semester, I was there, and Ryan was talking to John, and one night, John was on the phone with his mom, and he had a phone call with his mom, and he was sitting in his dorm room, and his mom told him, he said, hey, me and your dad are splitting up. Me and your dad are splitting up. And he was so angry. He was so upset. He was like, why? He threw so many questions at her, and he was like, why? He was so angry, and the phone call ended with him hanging up on her, and he fell and he was broken. And Ryan had heard the phone call go down, and Ryan, who was his suite mate, walked into the room and opened his arms and gave him a big hug. And when John told me this story, he looked at me, he said, it felt like God opened his arms for me and said, I'm here, my child. I'm here for you. And so later, this semester, John started attending the young adult group at Rocky Creek Church in Greenville, South Carolina. And that next week, John had accepted Jesus Christ into his life for the first time. He had accepted Jesus after the struggles that he had gone through. And just his accepting Jesus into his life, guess what? His dad made the 360 and came back, and now he's a believer in Jesus Christ. So just by one person that accepted Jesus into their life, by one person living for Christ in a locker room, guess what? 2 people were saved by one person living for Jesus. So it's so important to live for Jesus. And guess what? I got a text during spring break when I was home. I got a text from John, and he said, hey, I got baptized, sent me the video. I watched and I fell in tears. I was so happy for my texting him. I said, man, I'm so proud of you, bro. And man, we keep texting back and forth. He lives in Texas, and man, we've been texting back and forth this whole summer, and it's going great for him. So here's my challenge for you. No matter what situation you're going through, no matter what struggle you fall into, live for Jesus in that moment.